lecture series. Laila will make the introduction shortly, but India Center is an incubator of ideas, research and education on contemporary India in the UCF. I also just want to pitch in for our next events. On 2nd April, we will have our first India Center distinguished lecture. Dr. Vivek Lal, the Chief Executive of General Atomics, will be here. So please do come for the distinguished lecture on 2nd April. We also have our annual India Center conference on 3rd of April. So I would invite you all to attend the annual conference. I will now pass over the mic to Laila to introduce our moderator for today.
Thank you, Yogesh. It's an honor for me to be introducing our moderator. Professor Ajay Singh is the truest eminent scholar chair of banking and professor and chair of the Department of Finance and director of the Dr. P. Phillips School of Real Estate here at UCF. And prior to coming to UCF, he was the Bolton, Perella, and Dowd Professor of Finance at Lee University. And he was also previously a professor of finance at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western University, where he oversaw the undergraduate program in finance. And Professor Singh has several publications in top-tier academic journals in finance. And he served in the investment bank group with the State Bank of India. His research interests have been informed by his past experiences. Among other topics, his research has been at the intersection of investment banking and corporate finance and seeks to understand whether the market's response to capital acquisition events in both international and domestic settings is consistent with rational and behavioral models. Thank you, Dr. Singh, for being such a strong supporter of the India Center and moderating today. And I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Lara. It's a great honor to be introducing Kapur to you. He has had every single important institution in this country, it seems. He came from India. He got his undergraduate degree in engineering from BHU in Banaras. And then he came to the University of Minnesota to get his master's in chemical engineering. Pivoted to Princeton, and from being a chemical engineer to inducing chemical changes in the political economy. He has been extremely successful. He has been the University of Texas at Austin, at UPenn, and he was at Harvard for a while. He was, it struck me a note in me because he was a Weatherhead fellow, and I used to know Al Weatherhead when I was at Case Western University. But it's such a distinguished career. Now, I have some prepared remarks, but I'm a little in awe of his work and the extent of the places that he's been to. He's the current Starr Foundation Professor of South Asian Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Previously, he was Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania, holding the Madan Lal Sophi Chair for the Study of Contemporary India. Prior to his tenure at Penn, he was Associate Professor of Government at the University of Texas at Austin and the Frederick Danziger Associate Professor of Government at Harvard. He received the Joseph R. Levinson Teaching Prize, awarded to the best junior faculty at Harvard College. And in 2005, he received the Outstanding Teaching in Political Science by the American Political Science Association. His book, Diaspora, Democracy and Development, the Impact of International Migration from India, earned him a 2012 Distinguished Book Award of the International Studies Association. So as you can see from both his educational background and the extent of the honors that he has received, you have a really distinguished speaker before you. Without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Kapur to speak.
Thank you.
thank you all for coming this morning. In my talk, what I'm going to do is just give you a background of sort of global migration and historically migration from India. Then a little bit of background of international migration sort of into the United States, of which Indian Americans are a small part of. And we look then more in some detail at Indian migration into the US. And then I'll pivot to its effects, both on the US and on India. And I'll look especially on effects on health, education, and research. So to begin with, on global migration, so there's some basic facts about 200. Someone is called an international migrant if she was born in country X and lives in country Y. That's the definition of migrant. So basically, about 3.6% of the world's population are migrants. The vast majority are economic migrants, and about 10% are refugees and asylum seekers. About half have moved from developing to developed countries. The other half is movement, say, within the European Union or from the EU, like the US, and so on. And about a third of all international migrants have a graduate degree. So you can see that in the last half century, international migrants in absolute numbers has grown by about 3.5 times. In relative terms, relative to the share of the global population, it's increased by about 50%. The top immigrant and immigrant countries, the top immigrant countries, India is the largest, followed by Mexico, Russia, China, and Bangladesh. And unsurprisingly, the US is the largest sort of recipient of immigrants. So to the extent that India is the largest immigrant country and the US is the largest immigrant country, we should not be surprised that there's been a growth of immigrants from India like the US. So if you just sort of look at the broader historical context of international migration from India, so there were three broad streams. One is the historical flows under the British Empire. After slavery ends, there's still a demand for labor, and that's where some indentured labor from India is abroad and goes around the world. The second is low-skilled migrants, usually high-skilled, less than high school, and that's largely linked to the Gulf, which begins after the first oil shock in 1973, and then the high-skilled migration to OECD countries dominated by the US. So historically, in the late 19th century, this is the migration from India, and it goes all the way from the Caribbean to the Pacific Ocean, in sort of, Fiji and so on. Today, these are the countries where Indian migrants have moved in the contemporary era. Largely, in the richer countries, they moved largely to Anglo-Saxon countries because of the English language. In Europe, it's dominated by Germany and Italy. The GCC is the largest number of migrants. That's the Gulf Cooperation Council. The largest being the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And then in the neighborhood, Mauritius, Malaysia, and so on. And that's broadly. So today, there are about 35 million, this is data from the government of India, about 16 million are so-called NRIs, which are non-resident Indians, which are Indian people who have an Indian passport living abroad, and about 20 million are what are called PIOs, persons of Indian origin. So people who were originally from India but now carry a foreign passport. OECD countries, Indians are the largest or second largest migrant group. They are the largest in the UK, and the second largest now in Australia, Canada, and the United States. Now, shifting to immigration into the US. So this is the long run from the middle of the 19th century to now, which is the number of immigrants in the United States and as a percentage of the US population. So what you see is in the second half of the 19th century, you have large numbers of immigrants. Then around the time of World War I, there's a growing backlash. By the early 20s, it all comes to an end. And so you see a sharp decline until after World War II. And then there's a historic shift because of the 1965 Immigration Reform Act. And you again see this increase as a share of the population. And unsurprisingly, as we're seeing now, you again are beginning to see a sort of backlash. This is data on the persons obtaining legal permanent residency. And again, you see that in the 1920s, you see a sharp decline, and then again, a gradual increase. This is the annual number of new US citizens, so people who become legal residents and then obtain citizenship. And as you can see, it's really grown very rapidly in the past few decades. Now, these immigration streams have really shifted massively. In the 19th century, it was largely from Northern Europe. In the late 19th and early 20th century, it was from Eastern Europe and from the Southern Europe, especially Italy. And then the sort of modern wave, which begins after 1965, what you see is that the dominant wave is, or the predominant wave is from Latin America, especially Mexico, but also then growing numbers from Asia, which is the columns are highlighted in Serbia. So if you look at the modern era, what you clearly see is this is prior to the Act passed in 1965. It's overwhelmingly dominated by Europe, and Europe's share declined very rapidly by 2000. And you see really being replaced by Latin America, and then increasingly we see growth from Asia, which is occurring in the past few decades. A different way is if you look at the 10 largest immigrant groups in 1960, other than Mexico, all the others are from Europe. If you look at it now, they're all basically Latin America and Asia. No European country is adopted. So what we really see over the past 6 decades is a massive shift, not just in the number of migrants, but the composition of migrants that are coming into the US. So now, let's sort of move to Indian migration into the US. So, at the turn of the 20th century, we began to see small numbers of migrants coming as laborers, especially into the West Coast. They were largely Sikhs who came. There was a huge backlash against this immigrant stream. Massive amounts of racism and so on. And then an act was passed in the 1910s, and what the act created was what's called the Asiatic Barred Zone. So this is the zone highlighted in green, and what the act did was to ban any immigration from the Asiatic Barred Zone, right? And that's the time when it comes to a stop. So even though the early numbers were a few thousands, but it basically comes to a stop by 1920. There are sort of sporadic number of students and so on, but the numbers are very, very small. Then when the act is passed, in Congress when the act is being discussed, the Secretary of State was asked by a congressman, look, there are more than 300 million people living in India. If we open up immigration to all races, might there be a flood like of India? And the Secretary of State sort of responds, this is his testimony, that he expects no more than 8,000 immigrants to come over the next 5 years. If you fast forward 50 years later, the number over 5 years is not 8,000, but it's 800 to 1,000. So complete, difference between what was expected and what happens. So this is how the population is. The size of the graph of the bars is not representative. It's a log scale, so it's misleading. These are the numbers that you should read. So you can see it's barely a few thousand. What happens is between 1930 and 1980, the numbers are so small that they're not even counted in these census. So that's why these numbers, they just stopped counting them. The other interesting thing was, because of the importance of race in the US, was how should the census identify race? So initially, they were identified, if you look at the US Census, under other race/white. Then they were identified under Hindu. Then it changed again to other race. It again changed to whites. They were classified. Then only from 1980, the definition has stuck, which is they're now classified under the term Asian Indian. So that's the growth that has occurred since 1980. As you can see, 70% are foreign born, but you see a real inflection point. You see the slope really inflects after 2000. So more than 60% of the entire Indian American immigrant population has come to this country after 2000. And that's what really changes it is something most of you will not remember, you're too young, called the Y2K problem, which is old computers were programmed in a way, the programming language was so old that most American programmers had no idea of the language, because Indian IT was so underdeveloped. Indian programmers knew the language because they were so behind, but the behind became an advantage because nobody else knew the language. And that's began this huge influx of Indian IT under the H-1B visa tech program. And that's been the primary source of this huge rapid growth. So if you look at the total US population and the Asian Indian population, that's the mix about, so while about 14% of the US population was born outside the US, 70% of the US Indian population was born outside the US. So if you look at, I just wanted to contrast Mexico and India, right? This is the change from 2010 to 2022, basically the most recent data we have. This is all this data is from the US census. What you actually see is that the change in net migration. So net migration is people who come in and people who go back. Right? It's always a two-way street. That actually net migration from Mexico was negative. And by far the largest net migration is from India and the US. Right? The other is the last column, which is the percentage of adults with bachelor's degree. And you again see that the migration stream from India is a real outlier, right, in the percentage who have a bachelor's degree. And why it matters, I'll show you. So you see this also now reflected newly naturalized citizens, unsurprisingly because of the history of migration from Mexico. Mexico is by far the largest, but after that it's sort of from India and so on. Surprisingly from China, it's actually begun to decline, like for various reasons. This is again similar data, but now from 2010 onwards, and you can see that around this time, China was close to the Philippines, but now the Philippines is the third largest. But basically, this is the story from 2010, and this is what we're likely to see over this decade. Mexico will be number one, and India will be number two. This is again from the census. You can see which parts. This gives you a clue from which parts of India and who's coming. So this is South Asian languages, and Urdu is of course also spoken by immigrants from Pakistan. So it includes also from India as well as from Pakistan. The fastest growing language among these is actually Telugu, which is from the Indian state of Andhra Pradesh, especially the region around Hyderabad. What has also grown hugely is the number of unauthorized immigrants, or to put it more pointedly, sort of illegal immigrants. Now, unlike if you look at the work on illegal immigration in the US, there's a big part that comes from Central America and Mexico. Now the illegality is the mode of entry. You enter through the southern border without some authorization. The Indian illegal immigrants are not illegal at the time of entry. They enter illegally, tourist visa, student visa, etc. But when the visa expires, those who stay on become illegal. And that's what you see. Now, what we see is that data from the Department of from Homeland Services, what you see is all of these, so this is from Pew, Homeland Security, Center for Migration. So these are the main migration research centers in the US. By definition, you cannot measure precisely know who is illegal in the country, right? These are all estimates. You have what is the total size of the population of the country, we know the number of legal migrants, and then you look at the difference. And that difference is your estimate of illegal migrants. But that is always a statistical estimate because we don't know how many people are going back, are returning, are leaving the country. But nonetheless, what they show is a huge increase. All of them showed this massive increase until 2014-15. But then the official US government estimate began to sharply diverge from the estimates from the other research sectors. And we've been trying to find out why, but we don't frankly know what's happening there. So now, I've given you data on the Indian American population, the native born population, the foreign born population, and the US average, right? So, I think two things which are correlated. You want to see education, right? And if you look at the US average, so this is actually, I'm sorry, this is a typo. Just compare this number with this number. So US average, 1 out of 3 of every American adult has a bachelor's degree. In the Indian case, it's about 4 out of 5. We know education is correlated with income, and so you see that the average income is also twice of the US average. So this really, I think, puts it in sharp perspective. This is all immigrants in the US by country of origin. And the bubbles represent the relative size of the immigrant population, right? And basically, between Mexico and India, you get the two extremes, right? These are the two largest migrant groups. The migration stream from Mexico is usually low skill, low education, and lowest income. The migration stream from India is highest education and highest income. And these are the two sort of core ends of this. One of the ways that you see is where this is reflected in the US economy. This is sort of data on immigrant founders of US, what are called unicorns, so companies that have a market capitalization of $500 million or more. And here you can see again that India, Israel are by far the two largest sources. I mean, Israel is quite remarkable because it's such a small country, and yet you see such a large number of entrepreneurs who started this, who have created these unicorns. So what about outcomes? So in the work, what we've done is, what we show is the outcomes have actually nothing to do with the characteristics of Indians per se, meaning this success. Because had it been that, then India would have been a much higher income country, and there would have been little reason to leave the country in the first place, right? So it's really about what we call selection. Now, I'm going to show you here, I'm going to now place Indian Americans in the larger Asian American context of immigration, right? So we know that Asian Americans among other immigrant groups have actually higher education and income. But actually, it's a very varied, you have a lot of variance. These are the 6 largest Asian American immigrant groups. Indians, Chinese, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Koreans, and Japanese. So what you see is that in terms of percentage of foreign-born Indians are the highest. This is the one that I think really matters in looking at outcomes, which is the percentage that were employer-sponsored. Now what matters is the success of immigrants in the United States depends not just on education, etc., but the visa type with which you come to the US. If you come as a refugee, if you come on a family-sponsored, the family-sponsored is by far the largest category through which people come to the US, your economic outcomes are lower than if you come on an employer-sponsored visa. And the reason is fairly obvious. You cannot, under US law, you cannot be sponsored by a firm if your salary is less than the median US salary. So you're already coming above the median, right? Whereas family-sponsored, all of this, salary income is not relevant criteria at all. And the fact that this is by far the highest among Indians, and that's what the H-1B tech visa has done. 2 out of 3 of all tech visas in the past 20 years have gone to immigrants from India. And that's really reflected in this number. And in some ways, this number, as much as the education data, really is behind the reason for this, for why they've done relatively well. In terms of, so you can see this in terms of median household income, right? Generally, I should have shown you in the earlier graph. If you see employer-sponsored, by far the lowest is Vietnamese. right? It's barely 12%. Now, if you see median household income, you'll also see that Vietnamese is the lowest, right? So any migrant group where family sponsorship is very high or the share of refugees is very high, economic outcomes overall, it's a higher mountain to climb, so to speak. This is just what we did in our book. What we showed is that, look, we know that human capital matters for economic outcomes. The average American is much more educated than the average Indian, right? So the average Indian average is here, average American is here. But the immigrants who are coming from India are coming from the tail end of the human capital distribution. The average of this is higher than the American average. So you're really, when you're comparing Indian immigrants to the American average, you really are comparing apples and oranges. Right? You're comparing the tail end of a distribution with the median of another distribution. And the tail end of any distribution of a large population will always be more talented, hardworking, etc., etc. Right? So that's why to compare Indian immigrants' outcomes with the average American is not comparing like with like. It's comparing two completely different distributions, and that's why we're seeing these outcomes. Now that was not, of course, the only reason. There are other reasons as well. So one is the nature of occupations. So when the first group of Indian Americans came from the mid-60s onwards, a large number came as doctors. Right? During the Vietnam War, roughly 1 out of 8, every new doctor in the US was from India. So extraordinary, and especially given India's abysmal health outcomes, this was an extraordinary, brain drain. And you can see this. This is data which I got from ECFMG, which is the entity in the United States that anyone trained as a doctor abroad, could be Ukraine, could be China, could be India, has to take this exam. So we compared the Indian graduates' exam results with the median of all other foreign trained graduates. And you can see that because the Indian doctors are coming from the tail end of the distribution, we tend to have better exam results. When you get better exam results, it's easier to get a residency and so on and so forth. The second is this unusual concentration in IT. So if you compare, this is Indian born, you see that compared to the native born population as well as all of the immigrants, it's by far, that's where the huge gap is, right? Now it so happens the IT sector has also been the fastest developing growth sector in the country. So in a sense, if you are in an occupation that is growing very rapidly, it's like stepping on an escalator because you grow much more rapidly. Right? And so that unusual concentration in an occupation which the United States was growing most rapidly sort of accelerated or amplified. The third occupational category where we see very high fractions is just PhDs. So in fields like computers or engineering, this is the percentage. About 1 out of 10 of every PhD in the United States is from India. Right. Again, these are fields where it's a high salary fields, basically, right? I'll skip this one and I'll show you this one. So I joke that it so happened that the United States and India were both colonized by the same power. Therefore, Indians know English better than many other immigrants. And we know in labor markets, proficiency in English does matter. And so you can see the proficiency in English that helps you in things from labor markets. So just sort of briefly to look at some of the economic sort of impacts. So India, because of the large number of migrants it has, is the world's largest recipient of sort of financial remittances. India gets about $125 billion a year from remittances. Roughly between a fifth and a quarter comes from the US. So it's about $30-odd billion is the remittances flowing from the United States to India from all these migrants. There are also flows through what we call the capital account in the balance of payments, which is sort of investment in sort of bank account, deposits, buying shares, equity, real estate, and so on, and that's the other source of flows. Now, when we compare the Indians with the Chinese, what we find is the financial flows from these two of the largest immigrant groups in the world to the countries of origin are about the same. But the composition is very different. In the case of Indians, it's largely financial remittances which go to family members and so on. Whereas the Chinese was much more actually foreign direct investment, which really helped to boost China's manufacturing power and exports from China. That has not been the case in the case of Indian immigrants. What Indian migration to the US did, it amplified the skill-intensive exports from India. So India is a labor, its endowments are much more in labor. It should have done much better in labor-intensive manufacturing. It has done very poorly compared to China. But what India did manage to do was to really increase its IT exports because of this link with the IT sector and Indian immigrants in the IT sector in the US. So what it has done is it has sharply increased income inequality in India because a small group, its wages have gone up much faster, whereas a large number of people who are not well educated, their incomes are going much slower because the links to the global economy are very different. So just the last thing on sort of human capital. If you look at health, India is the world's largest exporter of physicians, the second largest exporter of nurses. About 5% of all the doctors now in the US are from India. What we see is, it's not just that doctors migrate, but the doctors trained in the best institutions, their propensity to leave is much higher. So you're not just losing your best human capital, but you're losing the best of the best in a sense. And the same thing is true of all of India's elite institutions. So this is data on immigrant healthcare workers in the US by country of birth. And the three largest are China, India, and the Philippines. Philippines, as we all know, is the world's supplier of nurses, which you see here. But India is by far the highest in terms of surgeons and doctors. International students. So what we see is, we know that until China opened up, there were no international students in China. You see barely. So China opened up in 79-80, and then you see a massive increase in international students coming to. But that peaks in 2018-19, and we've seen a sharp decline from students from China in the last 5 years. Whereas India's has been accelerating. So most recent data we have is now India is the largest source of international students to the United States. Now, if we look at the reason I'm focusing on graduate students, because when it comes to research and tech, that's what begins to matter more. What you see is that students from China are much larger than India when it comes to PhD students, but where the Indian concentration is massively is in masters students in STEM fields. That's where you really see this large increase that is taking place. This is true if we look at PhDs, and you can see over the last decade that the number of PhDs in STEM fields from China is about twice that like from India. This is similar. Now, what we also see, this is stay rates, right? So one of the arguments is the US trains all these people in doctoral programs, does it manage to retain them? And there you see actually both from India and China, the stay rates are extremely high. They are above, 90%. In fact, 94% in most recent data. So barely 5 to 6% actually go back. This has, as I said, because of this flow of talent, you can see that when it comes to, this is KTI stands for knowledge and technology in industries. And you can see that India's share is extremely low, has barely changed, whereas China, you can see, has really amplified, because the brain drain's effects on India have been much more acute than in the case of China. This is as well true, less true, but this is the migration of inventors. So people, because these are the most creative people, right, of inventors. And you see the US is a huge recipient, right, net. So people who created inventions, etc., the US is a massive magnet for attracting that talent. Whereas from China and India, these are countries where